Well, good afternoon, and welcome to Quest Club. This is the start of our 2025 to 2026 Quest year. Thank you for being here today. On October 3rd, 1863, expressing gratitude for a pivotal Union Army victory at Gettysburg, President Abraham Lincoln announces that the nation will celebrate an official Thanksgiving holiday on November 26th, 1863. We're now on the 276th day of the year and have 89 days left in 2025. Again, welcome, and I'd like to have our invocation today by Susan Meyer.
4 years ago, I wrote a paper for Quest on what does the pursuit of happiness means? And we all know that it means a lot of different things to a lot of different people, and not all those things are good either. The one thing that most everyone agrees on is that gratitude is really the best way to experience happiness. It gives you feeling grateful for what you have and not wanting more, or what your neighbor has, or what's on TV being advertised or whatever. And it gives you a feeling of peace and satisfaction, and that can lead to happiness if you can be grateful for what you have. But what if you think that you don't have anything to be thankful for? A man by the name of John Kralik felt exactly that way. His law firm was losing money. He was going through a second painful divorce. He was out of funds and living in a small, cramped apartment, and his sons had grown distant from him. In short, it was the lowest moment of his life. Not long after that, John received a thank you note for a gift from his ex-girlfriend, and he was so grateful to receive it, that somebody was thankful to him, that he determined that maybe writing thank you notes to others would increase his sense of gratitude. He did just that, even though he had never done that before. He'd never written thank you notes for anything, Christmas presents or anything. His first one was to one of his sons, which led to the two of them having lunch and reconnecting. John wrote one every day for a year to a family member, a friend, someone who'd been kind to him. I think he even wrote to his the dry cleaner person and the barber and all those people. Anyway, in the process, he noticed that he was less stressed and angry because he was no longer focusing on himself, but on the kindness of others. At the same time, unforeseen, good things kept happening to him as a result of his gratitude. A year later, John's life was much better. He began receiving thank you notes more than he had written, and reading over them provided a calming influence on his life. In all, he has written 729 thank you notes. And in his book, which I just happen to have, he writes his 730th thank you notes to his readers for reading his story and for letting him know that it had encouraged and inspired them to find the healing power of gratitude in their lives. John Kralik says that he doesn't view writing thank you notes as a self-help system, and he doesn't say that we all should write 365 thank you notes in a year. But he does see it as an exercise in good manners, and admits that it made him a better and much happier man. Even if we don't write thank you notes, we can still be grateful. We can be grateful for our families, for our friends, for kindness, for the beauty of nature, and for just being alive. And that will most likely lead to a happier existence for all of us.
Today's topic is Madam Secretary Frances Perkins, presented by Dr. Kim Barnett-Johnson. Dr. Barnett-Johnson is a native of Fort Wayne, Indiana, and a graduate of Southside High School. She earned a bachelor's degree from Taylor University, Upland, Indiana, in accounting systems, a master's degree from Indiana University Fort Wayne in liberal arts, and a PhD in higher education administration from Indiana State University, Terre Haute, Indiana. Her research topic focused on African American women in higher education, concentrating specifically on the search and selection process for administrative positions and its challenges for African American women. In the August of 2010, she published an article in Women in Higher Education entitled, Moving Heaven and Earth, African American Women and Administrative Search and Selection Process. She's been in higher education professional for more than 30 years, serving in numerous roles such as administration counselor, diversity coordinator, director of financial aid, instructor, dean, and vice chancellor for academic affairs. She is currently the chancellor for Ivy Tech Community College, Fort Wayne, Cossiano County service area. Dr. Barnett-Johnson is a trained conflict mediator as well as a volunteer board member for various community organizations. In addition to these community activities, she's an active church member serving on the youth ministry leadership team and choral singer director. Her hobbies include cooking, reading, and listening to music. Her greatest gift of giving has been as a foster parent for more than 10 years. During these 10 years, Kim and her late husband welcomed approximately 16 children into their home, with the ages ranging from 23 days to 16 years old, and she's currently a CASA volunteer. She has 3 children, Ebony, Dalen, Drevon, and 1 grandson, BJ. Please, let's welcome Kim.
All right, so good afternoon, fellow Questers, and welcome to the 2025-26 presentation season. I'm happy to be here today and even more excited to share with you all the wonderful things that I have learned about Madam Secretary Frances Perkins. But before I get started, I want to get started with an icebreaker. Ready? So tell me, what woman in American history had the worst childbirth experience? A lot of women would probably raise their hand and say, me, but it wasn't me. Any thoughts? Guys have no clue. Well, you know, if you thought about the topic for the day, you probably could have got it. The answer is Frances Perkins, because she spent 12 years in labor. See? All righty, so my goal for the next 20 minutes or so is to enlighten each of you with the story of Fannie Coralie Perkins and to paint a picture of how her tenacity, her confidence, her courage, her loyalty, and fearlessness were key characteristics that helped her to change the narrative for her time. I learned a lot while conducting this research, and I hope that you walk away from this presentation having a better understanding of who she was and why her work was so significant in American history. So let's get started, and I'm going to start with an epilogue that I found in the book written by Kirsten Downey. It's entitled The Woman Behind the New Deal, and if you're interested in learning more about the subject, Frances Perkins, you might want to get that book. It's phenomenal. But it's The Woman Behind the New Deal, The Life and Legacy of Frances Perkins. On a chilly February night in 1933, a middle-aged woman waited expectantly to meet her employer at his residence on East 65th Street in New York City. She clutched a scrap of paper with hastily written notes. Finally ushered into his study, the woman brushed aside her nervousness and spoke confidently. They bantered casually for a while, as was their style. Then she turned serious, her dark, luminous eyes holding his gaze. He wanted her to take an assignment, but she had decided she wouldn't accept it unless he allowed her to do it her own way. She held up a piece of paper in her hand, and he motioned for her to continue. She ticked off the items: a 40-hour work week, a minimum wage, workers' compensation, unemployment compensation, a federal law banning child labor, direct federal aid for unemployment relief, Social Security, a revitalized public employment service, and health insurance. She watched his eyes to make sure that he was paying attention and understood the implications of each demand. She braced for his response, knowing that he often chose political expediency over idealism and was capable of callousness, even cruelty. The scope of her list was breathtaking. She was proposing a fundamental and radical restructuring of American society with an enactment of historic social welfare and labor laws. To succeed, she would have to overcome opposition from the courts, business, labor unions, and conservatives. Nothing like this has ever been done in the United States before, she said. You know that, don't you? The man sat across from her in his wheelchair amid the clutter of boxes and rumpled rugs. Soon he would head to Washington, D.C. to be sworn in as the 32nd President of the United States. He would inherit the worst economic crisis in nation's history. An era of rampant speculation had come to an end. The stock market had collapsed, rendering investments valueless. Banks were shutting down, stripping people of their lifetime savings. About a third of the workers were unemployed, wages were falling, hundreds of thousands were homeless. Real estate prices had plummeted, and millions of homeowners faced foreclosure. His choice of labor secretary would be one of the most important early decisions. His nominee must understand economic and employment issues, but be equally effective as a coalition builder. No one was more qualified for the job. She knew as much about labor law and administration as anyone in the country. He'd known her for more than 20 years, the last 4 in Albany, where she had worked at his side. He trusted her and knew she would never betray him. But placing a woman in the labor secretary's job would expose him to criticism and ridicule. Her list of proposals stirred heated opposition, even amongst his loyal supporters. An 8-hour day was a standard plank of the Socialist Party. Unemployment insurance seemed laughably improbable. Direct aid to the unemployed would threaten his campaign pledge of a balanced budget. He said he would back her. It was a job she had prepared for all her life. She had changed her name, her appearance, even her age to make herself a more effective labor advocate. She had studied how men think so she could better succeed in a man's world. She had spent decades building crucial alliances. Still, she told the president-elect that she needed time to make her decision. The next day, she visited her husband, a patient in a sanitarium. He was having a good day, and he understood when she told him about the job offer. His first impulse was to fret for himself, asking her how the new job might affect him. When she assured him that he could remain where he was and that her weekend visits would continue, he gave his permission. That night in bed, the woman cried in deep, wailing sobs that frightened her teenage daughter. She knew the job would change her life forever. She would open herself to constant media scrutiny, harsh judgment from her peers, and public criticism for doing a job a woman had never done before. Yet she knew she must accept the offer. As her grandmother had told her, whenever a door opened for you, you have no choice but to walk through it. The next day, she called Franklin Roosevelt and accepted the offer. Frances Perkins would become the nation's first female Secretary of Labor. So who is Frances Perkins? Frances was born Fannie Coralie Perkins on April 10th of 1880 to Frederick and Susan Perkins. Prior to Fannie's birth, the family turned to dairy farming for its sustenance. Her father, Frederick, was educated as a member of the upper class, while her mother, Susan, was admired locally for her skills at animal husbandry. But Frederick wanted a better life for himself and his family, and off to Boston they moved, where his brother Augustus had established a law practice. Boston is where Frances was born, and Frederick found a job as a retail clerk at a department store. By 1882, Frederick was again dissatisfied with his employment prospects and decided to move his family, but this time to Worcester, Massachusetts, which was approximately 40 miles from Boston. Worcester was known as a location where a newcomer could afford to launch a business of his own, and it was there that he and his partner, George Butler, opened a stationery and office supply store. In 1884, Frederick and Susan had their second child, Ethel. Fanny grew up in middle class in Worcester. The family lived in boarding houses before they finally settled into a comfortable frame house in an upper middle class neighborhood. They were staunch Congregationalists and faithful churchgoers. Fanny knew very early in age that she would never be able to rely on physical attractiveness to create opportunities for her future. That message was delivered strong and clear by her mother as they were out shopping for hats one day. In the 1890s, fashionable hats were slim and narrow, decorated with colorful ribbons, and most often topped with flowers and feathers in order to add inches to the woman's height. As they were shopping, her mother pointed to a dimpled, three-cornered, tricorn-styled hat, very similar to the ones worn by the Revolutionary War soldiers. Her mother said, "You should always wear a hat something like this. You have a very broad face, and it's broader between the two cheekbones than it is up at the top. Your head is narrower above the temples than it is at the cheekbones. Also, it lops off very suddenly into your skin. The result is that you always will need to have as much width in your hat as you have in the width in your cheekbones. Never let yourself get a hat that is narrower than your cheekbones because it makes you look ridiculous." These words left an everlasting impact on Fanny, and that hat would come to symbolize the plain, sturdy, and dependable woman that became Frances Perkins. She always felt strangely out of step with women of her time and came to realize that rather than beauty, she had to find other qualities and skills to help set her apart, to help her achieve her goals. Fanny was considered an exceptional child. She was seen as being unusually verbal and articulate and had much more in common with her father than other members of her immediate family. Fanny's tightest family bond was with her paternal grandmother, Cynthia, who often cited endless aphorisms about how individuals should behave when they are facing adversity. Fanny spent numerous summers with her grandmother, Cynthia Otis Perkins, who was the center of the family. Later in life, Frances explained, "I am extraordinarily the product of my grandmother," as she felt it was her grandmother's wisdom that guided her throughout life. As a teenager, Fanny was distanced from both her mother and her sister. Fanny saw her sister as a moody girl who was uninterested in academic pursuits. And as for her mother, she saw her as a woman who basically was plain-spoken, but peppery to the point of abrasiveness. Susan, her mother, really didn't understand the extraordinary child that she had in Fanny. Her father, on the other hand, paid particular attention to his precocious daughter. He taught the child to read Greek when she was 8, and he began to prepare her for college. Please note that during this time, only 3% of women went on to higher education, but he made sure that she received the best education by sending her to Worcester Classical High School, along with other affluent children, most of which were boys. She had what was considered an unusual childhood, and her parents were conflicted by the way they chose to raise her. They were very proud of her intelligence, but ambivalent about what the future might hold for an educated woman. Fanny took an early interest in the plight of the poor and unfortunate. She was able to feel the pain of others and lamented for their suffering. She saw firsthand how her mother frequently attended to the needs of the poor neighbors and encouraged her daughter to also befriend them. However, it is noted that even though Fanny's parents were quick to provide assistance to the poor, they also felt themselves superior to them. Even still, Fanny wondered quite often on the reasons why some people were poor and others were not. It was when she read the book entitled How the Other Half Lives that her eyes were opened to a new world. In this book, the author wrote about the 100,000 people in New York's Lower East Side who were living in homes not fit for human habitation, and thousands of children who were abandoned with no homes at all, surviving from street scraps. In addition to this, the increased influx of immigrants, which began in the 1880s, was at an all-time high. By 1907, the number had risen to 1.3 million, and the natives were beginning to feel some resentment towards the newcomers. Fanny also took notice in that she saw these individuals being abused by the native born, and she also saw it unjust that the very people who benefited from their labor would also despise them. As she grew in her sense of social justice, the treatment of immigrants drew her attention to the same levels as when she noticed the toils of the poor. Upon graduating from high school, Fanny enrolled at Mount Holyoke, a college for women that was close to home. The school was founded as an educational institution to prepare young women to be missionaries or teachers. Tuition and board were approximately $250 a year, and the women who were also required to perform 50 minutes of housework on a daily basis in order to defray some of their expenses. She majored in chemistry and physics, but was most impressed by her American Economic History course. She was not an outstanding student, but her social skills set her apart. She had overcome the extreme shyness of her childhood, and her popularity made her a natural leader. In 1901, a new president arrived to the college by the name of Mary Woolley. Miss Woolley was one of the first women to graduate from Brown University, was a biblical history scholar, and a previous administrator at Wellesley College. She had high expectations for Mount Holyoke, as she desired to make it one of the most notable colleges of its time. Woolley was different. She wasn't married and had not felt as if her life had suffered at all because of it. Woolley's life showed the young women that marriage was a possibility for the future, but not a requirement for a satisfying lifestyle. Another woman that was a great influence in the life of Fanny was Florence Kelley, who served as the executive secretary of the National Consumer League. She was a guest lecturer at the college while out on a national lecture tour to introduce a new organization that she was forming. This organization would be dedicated to abolishing child labor and eliminating tenement work and sweatshops. Kelley was remarkably different from any other woman Fanny had met. She was fiery, energetic, infused with idealism, but also pragmatic. She was also one of the most politically radical people that Fanny had ever met. Kelley became Fanny's mentor, friend, and guide. Fanny graduated from college in 1902, and unlike most girls who return home to find work, Fanny was very different. She wasn't the same girl that had left her parents' home 4 years earlier. She was more strong-willed and had a sense of mission. She desired to help the poor and therefore decided not to return home, but instead to travel to New York City against her parents' wishes, to seek a career in social work. Her parents saw New York City as the den of iniquity and pleaded with her to abandon those plans, but she declined. When she arrived, her first stop was at the offices of the charity organization Society, demanding a meeting with the Society's director, Edward Devine. When offered an opportunity to meet with another staff member, she refused, insisting on meeting with Mr. Devine. After much persistence, Mr. Devine agreed to meet with Fanny. He asked what she wanted to do, and she replied that she wanted to see the poor, give them help, and untangle their problems. He found that response to be rather interesting, so he asked a follow-up question, which was, well, what would you do if you were sent out to a family who applied for help and you came to the tenement to find the father drunk in bed and the children with sore throats and sick, no food in the house? The mother looked disheveled and disorderly, the dishes were piled high, and the mother had just been beaten by the drunk father. She smiled and said, "I'd send for the police at once and have the man arrested, of course." But that was not the answer he was hoping for. He explained that the best way to rehabilitate the family would be to get the parents back to work, sober them up, and teach them to help themselves. Simply put, he told Fanny, who was 21 years old at the time, that she was too young, unworldly, and inexperienced with the work. He went on to say that she lacked the judgment and life experience to effectively assist those in need. He provided her with a list of books to read and sent her on her way with an armload of social work newsletters. Disappointed in her first attempt to be a social worker, Fanny returned home. Her parents discouraged her from pursuing a graduate degree, but instead to begin looking for a suitor and get married. She decided, however, to take several teaching jobs and to do some volunteer mission work with her sister, but she desperately missed college. So in 1904, 2 years after graduating, she heard about an opening teaching at a women's college in Chicago. She inquired by mail and then took the job sight unseen. Fanny was desperate to get out of Worcester and away from her family, citing that a prophet has no honor in his own country. Immediately upon arriving to Chicago, a major change took place. Fanny changed her name, her faith, and her political persuasion. Sometime before 1904, she officially changed her name to Frances Perkins. There's no clear record as to why she changed her name, but some cited that she may have felt that her given name lacked dignity and carried an unfortunate association with a woman's posterior. It also was an easy name to ridicule, and she often endured just that when others wanted to belittle or patronize her. She also may have recognized that by having a gender-neutral name, she would have greater employment advantages. In June of 1905, Frances rejected her family's faith, leaving the Congregationalist Church and joining the Episcopalian Church because she sought a more structured religion and a more formal ceremony. According to the authors, the Episcopalian Church helped her to remain serene and centered at the time of stress. The church's teachings also gave her substantive guidance about the right path to take when confronted with decisions, and the hopeful message of Christianity helped her to retain her optimism. Her religious commitment was real, but her switch to Episcopalian also gave her a ready social stepladder. Did she ever find love? The answer is yes. As with any young person out in the world trying to find themselves, Frances had a few encounters with gentlemen that seemed to be heading into long-term relationships, but all of them ended up going nowhere. However, in 1910, Frances met Paul Caldwell Wilson, who was from a wealthy merchant family. They began as friends and as frequent correspondents before starting a romantic relationship. He and Frances ran in similar political and social circles, and after they married in 1933, she opted to keep her surname, which was extremely rare and controversial for the time. She ultimately found herself in court to defend her decision. It was important to her that she preserved her own identity and had already made a name for herself. She also did not want to affect her husband's career. Things started off very well for them at the beginning, but around 1915, things took a negative turn in their marriage as she discovered that her husband was having an affair and had planned to leave him. However, she discovered at that time that she was pregnant with child and therefore opted to remain in the marriage. Her first pregnancy resulted in a miscarriage. Her second pregnancy resulted in stillbirth. She gave birth to her daughter, Susanna, in 1916. Her marriage to Paul has seen some improvements, but unfortunately, shortly after the birth of Susanna, Paul began to show symptoms of mental illness, which ultimately resulted in his inability to secure employment or help with household responsibilities. He was in and out of sanitariums, and Frances ultimately became solely responsible for taking care of their family. her early careers in social work. It was when Frances was introduced to the Hull House that she felt as if she finally found the work in which she sought. Hull House was the nation's leading settlement house located in what was known as the ghetto, and described this way because of the area's overpopulation, as well as the fact that the neighborhoods were strewn with garbage. Settlement houses were actually boarding houses where people lived and ate communally as a large extended family dedicated to civic improvement. Many social workers and community activists lived there in exchange for working with needy families. This particular house provided job training, health services, child care, a library, and a savings bank. And it didn't take long for Frances to move from being a drop-in guest worker to a regular visitor and occasional resident. She was unable to move in full-time because of her obligations as the science teacher at Ferry Hall, which was an affluent women's college in Lake Forest, Chicago. She considered her work at Hull House life-changing. She saw situations firsthand that she had only read about in books, and came to realize how difficult it was to unravel these social problems. She also knew that her family did not care for the work she was doing at Hull House, but one thing was clear: social work was her calling. She therefore began looking for a paid position in social work. Philadelphia was her next stop, where she took on a position of general secretary for a group known as the Philadelphia Research and Protective Association. Frances had to raise money to pay for her own salary and her research costs, yet she was determined. She often pawned her watch at a local pawn shop in order to make ends meet, only to repurchase it when she received her next paycheck. However, in spite of it all, Frances approached each challenge with gusto. Her research uncovered evidence that not only European immigrant women were being exploited, but young Black women from the rural South were being transported to the city for prostitution. As a result, she and an African-American graduate from Cornell University built a list of reputable boarding houses with the hopes of steering these young women away from the less desirable places. She also investigated employment agencies to determine if they were legitimate. She even went so far as applying for jobs to try them out. She visited more than 165 flea bag lodging houses where women were housed, and in which she met many of the lowest paid prostitutes. It was there that she uncovered the widespread overcrowding and poor sanitation. As a result, she set out and successfully closed 4 houses by testifying before the city public safety officials about what she had witnessed. She often laughed when imagining how her family, ignorant of the seamy side of her life, would react if they knew what she was doing. This work, though, did not come without risks. Disrupting the lives of pimps and other criminals had its consequences, and Frances had to face that as well. One evening, she was accosted by 2 men whose businesses had been disrupted. But Frances fought them off with her umbrella and by shouting their names. Startled by her actions, they turned and ran, and she later prodded the officials to officially shut down these men's illicit establishments. Frances's financial struggles didn't get any better, and she decided to interview women who earned half as much as she did at $6 per week doing factory work. They lived meager lives and relied heavily on cash gifts from dinners with men to make their ends meet. Frances and other social investigators realized that such reliance is only a short step from prostitution. She also learned that women were almost always paid less than men, were given less desirable jobs, and because of their gender, were barred from union participation. It became crystal clear to Frances that she needed to continue her education in order to dispute these economic and labor issues more effectively. So in 1908, Frances was given an opportunity for a fellowship at Columbia University, returning to New York, but this time with a job in hand and with recommendations to the people who had previously rejected her. Some events that changed her life. Several years had passed now, and Frances was serving as the head of the New York office of the National Consumer League. In this role, she continued to advocate for better working hours and conditions for the less fortunate. In 1911, Frances witnessed a horrific event known as the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire. This factory employed hundreds of workers, mostly women. The owner regularly kept all the doors and stairwells locked in order to prevent the employees from taking breaks. What was even more unfortunate was that the majority of the company's fire escapes were not working. When the building caught fire, several tried to escape but were unsuccessful. And on that tragic day, 146 workers died. Just 1 year prior, Perkins had championed the fight for these same employees for a 54-hour work week and other benefits. Frances, devastated by this, ended up leaving this position, blaming tax legislation for the loss. And at the recommendation of Theodore Roosevelt, she then became executive secretary for the Committee on Safety of the City of New York to improve fire safety. Keeping the horror of the Triangle Fire alive was indeed a challenge. She gave speeches where she told the story of the girl who had been released from the hospital after 2 years of treatment. Stories of 2 women whose daughters had died in that fire and how these mothers suffered from mental collapses and became public charges. And another of a man who escaped by climbing down cables but injured his back, leaving his family to survive only by his wife's meager wages. In this new role, Frances was instrumental in getting the New York legislature to pass a 54-hour bill that capped the number of hours women and children could work. She was also able to establish the city's first Bureau of Fire Prevention, which created a new kind of government entity, the New York State Factory Investigating Commission. The commission was empowered to investigate questionable working conditions around the state and to recommend legislative remedies. Frances's priorities had not changed much since her days at the National Consumer League. Poor conditions in cellular bakeries, long hours and poor wages for women, child labor, and workplace fire hazards. The Factory Investigation Committee had the same 4 primary areas of focus, and Perkins' research was the backbone of the investigation. So let's fast forward to 1919, when Frances, then 38 years old, managed to find time to help a friend, Al Smith, who ran for and won the seat as the governor of New York. It was just a few weeks into Mr. Smith's term in office that rumors began about how she might benefit from his election. It was a colleague that informed her that she would be appointed to be a member of the Industrial Commission. Frances laughed because in her mind, there was no way that a woman would be named by the governor to hold one of the most coveted jobs of providing oversight of factory conditions. Females still couldn't vote in the national elections, and hiring a woman for any top-flight job was very risky. She heard nothing else about this for a couple of weeks and did her best to forget about it. At the forefront of her mind was her need to take care of her ailing husband and their 2-year-old child. However, she also knew that the idea wasn't too far-fetched. She had built a strong working relationship with Al, and she knew that she had impressed him with the work that she had done up until this point. So that day finally came. Al Smith asked Frances to join the commission. He desperately wanted her help. He told her, he said, it's in terrible condition, and nobody knew better how to make it more effective. Frances, however, was very reluctant. She was afraid of making mistakes that might ruin both her and the work that she was doing. Social work and politics were 2 very different things, and Frances wasn't sure she wanted to make that type of transition. Downey writes that Frances knew that it would be a lonely world, separated from female companionship, surrounded by cigar-chomping, tobacco-spitting opportunists in Albany, men she knew would criticize her. However, she swallowed hard and she accepted the position. The New York Times predicted that there would be some backlash with this appointment, and it didn't take long for the critics to speak. Members of the State Federation of Labor voiced opposition to her nomination, but later they publicly denied ever opposing her. Another New York businessmen's organization protested her appointment, stating that she was too radical, and others just outright opposed, stating that such a highly paid post would not only make her the top paid woman in government, but probably in the United States. Please note that the position came with an $8,000 annual salary, which is equivalent to approximately $145,000 in 2024. However, Frances's friends rallied around her. They organized a letter-writing campaign which flooded the governor's office, and Smith stuck by his candidate, and on February 18, 1919, after 13 Republicans joined the Democratic minority to support her, she was confirmed in Senate on a 34-16 vote. Ironically, Frances was neither Democrat or Republican. She considered herself more of an independent and hadn't felt the need to change anything because she still didn't have a right to vote. Yet Smith still urged her to become a Democrat, and she ultimately registered as such, understanding that party affiliation would give her a sense for having a political family. As her first day on the job approached, she felt a sense of nervousness, but decided to go in boldly and even bought a new dress. She called the head of the commission, John Mitchell, because no one told her when to start work, where to go, and how to go about getting sworn in. He was confused himself, so she told him that she would be there at 9 a.m., and he agreed. When she arrived, he was clearly unprepared for her confirmation and was very uneasy about working with a woman. After searching feverishly for a Bible to use at the confirmation, which Frances insisted upon, she was sworn in and promptly escorted to the office where she would occupy. She sat down at an empty desk with nothing to do. None of the other commissioners even came by to greet her, but that didn't deter her, because in true Frances fashion, she took command of the situation, and she started with the staff members that she knew in order to learn more about their work. She asked them a lot of questions, again, primarily about their jobs. She learned that the commission did little work, kept no regular calendars, and studiously avoided issues that might produce political heat. She quickly learned who was competent and who was not. As far as the other commissioners were concerned, she introduced herself to all of them, and most of them accepted her, but Mitchell himself still had harbored ill feelings about her. They were still holding a grudge with her because of a report that she had written in a previous role, accusing the commissioners of moral responsibility for the deaths of workers at a Brooklyn candy factory. She had even circulated a petition demanding that sitting commissioners be replaced and then sign her name at the very top of the list. However, to make peace, she apologized, and after weeks of visiting his office almost every day, asking for advice and deferring to him before taking any actions, he eventually warmed up to her by listening to her comments and ultimately allowing her to assume more control of the commission's work. 6 months into her position, fellow Commissioner James Lynch called Perkins's contributions invaluable. And he also stated, "I am convinced that more women ought to be placed in high positions through the State Department." Her time as Secretary of Labor. I opened my presentation with an excerpt from Kirsten Downey's book, The Woman Behind the New Deal, and it gave insight into Frances Perkins becoming the first woman to serve as the Secretary of Labor, a role of which she served in from 1933 to 1945. When Franklin Roosevelt became president, he and Frances had known each other for 23 years and had been close political allies for almost a decade. Their bond was very unusual for that time because not many men in that area could accept a woman as their equal, but Roosevelt was different. Frances recognized this in him, and because of it, he won her loyalty. Loyalty even during times of difficulty. Roosevelt served 3 terms as president, and during those 3 terms, Frances tried at numerous times to resign from her position. Each time, President Roosevelt declined her request. When Roosevelt started his 3rd term, Frances again planned to leave the position. She no longer felt as if her work was of high importance because the country had become more focused on war. She believed that her role of running interference between Roosevelt and the people he offended, including his wife, had grown tiresome. Ultimately, she sensed that she had accomplished as much as she could. She had grown weary of wielding power. She said, the more authority you have, the more impossible situations you're going to come up against, and the more your conscience is going to be boiling all the time and keeping you awake at night. So Francis again asked for his permission to step down, but Roosevelt wouldn't say yes, and he wouldn't say no. He instead asked for some time to think about it. Frances waited, and she waited for weeks, hearing nothing. So she solicited assistance from Eleanor, the president's wife. Eleanor was also hesitant, but it wasn't because she didn't feel that she would have a chance to speak with him. She stated that she rarely has time to speak with him about anything serious. However, Frances insisted, and Eleanor ultimately conceded. A week or so later, an answer came in a note from Eleanor. It said, "I have talked with him about it, and the answer is no. Absolutely no." She later learned that President Roosevelt felt that in light of everything happening at that time, he couldn't risk more scrutiny because of her leaving. He was obviously unwilling to make any changes, and he told Frances, "I didn't see how I was going to do it. It's personal. I know who you are, what you'll do, and what you won't do. You know me. You see a lot of things that most people don't see. You keep me guarded against a lot of the things that no new man here would protect me from." It was then that Frances decided that she would drop dead in her traces before she abandoned him, particularly in face of war. People in Washington continued to be mystified by their relationship, as the relationship was a troubling anomaly. No other woman, European or American, before Frances had ever played such a high-profile role in public life, unless within a hereditary aristocracy or because of a sexual liaison. There were some, however, that felt that if they knew the real truth, in their eyes, the New Deal, which was a significant outcome during Roosevelt's 3 terms, was indeed a Frances Perkins creation. So what was the New Deal? The New Deal was a series of economic programs and reforms enacted in the United States between the years of 1933 and 1939 by President Roosevelt in response to the Great Depression. The goal was to provide immediate economic relief and to address the financial issues that caused the crisis. Policies were categorized into 3 areas: relief, providing direct aid to the unemployed, poor, and farmers; recovery, focusing on implementing programs designed to restore the economy to a normal level of operation; and reform, which focused on long-term changes to prevent a future depression by regulating industry, finance, and agriculture. Frances was considered the key architect of the New Deal, and her significant contributions as the chair of the Committee on Economic Security included the Social Security Act of 1935, which established a system of old age pension, unemployment compensation, and federal support for public health and welfare. This act was seen as the most important act of the New Deal because this legislation affected the lives of every man, woman, and child in the country. Fair Labor Standards Act of 1939, which established the first federal minimum wage, mandated overtime pay, set a maximum 40-hour work week, and outlawed child labor. The Civilian Conservation Corps, also known as CCC, which provided manual labor jobs for millions of unemployed young men, focusing on natural resource conservation and development. expansion of labor rights, which protected workers' rights to organize unions and bargain collectively, and workplace safety and industrial reform. There were many who attempted to claim credit for the creation of the Social Security Act, but to those closest to the process, Francis was the most responsible. By 1936, Francis could report that nearly 1 million people were receiving benefits. Nearly 750,000 were old people. That's not their words, not mine. 184,000 were dependent children, and nearly 18,000 were blind. In addition to this, all the states had enacted unemployment compensation laws. On the day of the presidential bill signing, Frances appeared happy but anxious. She had just learned that her husband, who, as mentioned earlier, was suffering from mental illness, had escaped his nurse's care and was roving alone in New York City. The author states, Frances had dropped from the economic security plan the one provision that would have helped her personally, national health insurance, which might have helped cover her husband. Perhaps the thought occurred to her as she traveled back to New York that day. She did find her husband, Paul, later that evening, unharmed. In addition to this very important work, Perkins also created the Immigration and Naturalization Service with the desire to create and implement immigration policies to humanize the treatment of immigrants in the United States. Her efforts experienced pushback, especially in Congress. Frances, the legacy. After Roosevelt's passing, she worked for the Truman administration and held that position until her husband's death in 1952. Her government career ended, but she didn't stop there. She returned to the classroom as a lecturer at the New York State School of Industrial Labor Relations at Cornell University until her death in 1965. She died from a stroke at the age of 85. Throughout her career, she recognized that fighting poverty improved the country for everyone. She connected with the right people at the right time, navigating a male-dominated government to leverage policies to help improve the lives of the most in need within the country, laborers, children, and widows. Frances Perkins left an indelible mark on American society as a policy visionary, labor advocate, and trailblazing woman. Her work fundamentally reshaped the American labor system and inspired future generations of women to lead, reform, and serve. Her specific impact on women includes expanded opportunities which helped them normalize the idea of women in leadership, especially in government roles. Policy focus, meaning that her reforms disproportionately benefited women, particularly working class and immigrant women who were often low paid and held unsafe jobs. Legacy of inclusion by showing that social justice could be pursued from within the system, influencing generations of women to seek change through public service. What does this all mean to me? I must admit that when I first received this topic, I had absolutely no idea who Frances Perkins was. But I am very happy to have received this topic. So I want to say to whomever suggested that she might be included on the list, thank you. I, being a woman, an African-American woman in leadership, found this research to be invigorating, encouraging, and empowering. Frances reaffirmed a lot of things for me, but my top 5 reminders are, first, it is important to speak up for and act on behalf of those less fortunate, and it's okay to be the loudest voice in the room. Second, don't shy away from tough assignments. Third, loyalty in your work is critically important if you want to make a true difference. Fourth, have the difficult conversations. And lastly, do not be intimidated if I am the only one in the room, because the work has to be done. Frances clearly showed that being the only woman in the room was not a showstopper. Thank you.